Most of what gets called governance is about keeping a company out of trouble. Beth Kaplan thinks that's only half the job. The other half, the half nobody puts on a board agenda, is whether the company has the cultural conditions for talent to do its best work. We talked about innovation, public investors, and the boardrooms she's actually sat in. Here's Beth.
That the question the board should look at each other and ask is how much do we trust each other? Truth is, over time, every board will face some very difficult moments. The ability to get to the right answer is a board that trusts and in a certain way loves each other.
Welcome to Collective Impact.
I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. So I'm Susanne Katus, and today I'm sitting down with Beth Kaplan. Beth, you have served in both operating leadership and in the boardroom, spanning different consumer brands such as Crocs, Rent the Runway, Brilliant Earth, the list can go on. And it's really that unique combination of being both an executive and a director that I'd love to dive in today. But particularly, you have a really good perspective on how questions around innovation, long term value creation, incentives get framed as governance decisions. And one of the things that I've really respected in getting to know you is that you gently push back on the way that those conversations typically get framed. So I'm really happy to have you here on the podcast.
Well, I'm excited to dive in.
As am I. And before we do dive in, can you give the listeners a little bit of your own arc, how you ended up moving between operating roles and the boardroom?
Sure. So I've had a really wonderful career. I've been very blessed that spans 35 years. I began my career in consumer goods with a company that really valued people and put a high premium on leadership development. That was Procter and Gamble. I would say for a very long time. My last role there, I was president of CoverGirl. So that was sort of a pinnacle experience for me. The next chapter was all in vertically integrated retail. So I had to learn a whole new skill set, frankly, and learn how to work with very different kinds of teams. So I worked in the drugstore industry. I worked in beauty, specialty retail. I was the president of General Nutrition Centers and Health and Wellness prior to taking the company public. And then I decided to make a leap. And I took a leap to join a very early stage scaling, technology based, consumer facing apparel company called Rent the Runway. And that was a whole new dynamic and a journey and a gift. So, and I was on the board there as I was on the board at GNC. So I had boardroom experience as an executive, which is very different when you sit in the boardroom. I was a director. So I was a director. So I had the fiduciary accountability, but I was also wearing management hat, which is very different. So after leaving my operating role, at Rent the Runway, I made a decision about how did I really want to shape the next chapter because I felt like I still had another one or two chapters left. And I sort of had to think about what did I really care most about? And it was working with great teams, but importantly, being able to take the patterning and learning of my 30 years and leadership and apply it in a way that was productive for younger talent. And that really just embarked on my first roles as a director. My first public company was actually Meredith, which was fascinating, which
Wow.
was, you know, brands, media brands. I had never worked in media. That's also what's so interesting about board work is that oftentimes you think that you're going to join a board that looks like a company that you operated in. And more likely than not, what they're looking for is the transference of insights and capabilities that are not resident in the management team. So it's sort of like so I'd never really worked in media, but I certainly understood brands and I understood through my Rent the Runway experience, marketing and how consumers engage and younger consumers engage with media. And that's what they were looking for in that particular boardroom. So that was really fascinating. That was my first board seat.
And what maybe surprised you most in terms of the difference of being on a board versus working in a management operating role?
You need to understand, it's what they always say, nose in, fingers out. You have to put a governor on yourself to understand your job is not to actually do the physical work or to fix things most of the time, but instead to make sure the right things are happening, which is a different skill set. And you remarked at the beginning about the gentle push. I had to evolve that way because I don't think anyone would have characterized me as a gentle pusher while I'm in my operating roles.
Title of your new book.
That's a good idea. But in the boardroom, it is more of a collective exercise, and you have to have respect for your fellow directors, and you have collective accountability. So to me, that's the understanding of the collective accountability versus the individual accountability is very different. And the need to truly understand that you're there to make sure the right things are happening, but not to do it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a delicate balance, I imagine, then, right? Because you've sat in both positions, you're used to probably being very hands on. And it gets me to a question that we've been talking about, this idea of innovation, which has taken on so many meanings in today's world, particularly just given the advancements that we've seen in technology. And from that standpoint, innovation typically gets framed as a product or an R&D type of a question. But since we've met, you and I have been talking about it really as a governance question. So I'd love to break that down a little bit and understand when you think about innovation as a governance question, what are some of the key elements that come to mind that you try to bring to your roles in both the boardroom and in a management position?
That is such a great question. Innovation, if you'd say like, well, what would an innovation agenda be? It would be the headline was like, how are we going to apply AI to
Right.
everything?
Productivity gains.
I think from a board standpoint, when boards think about governance, if you were to read Board 101, they would say governance more or less is about making sure that the company stays out of trouble.
Right.
So it's about an audit function. It's about regulatory compliance. It's about things that ensure that shareholders, don't see something going on at the company that's wrong. Alignment between pay practices and performance. Those are like global governance issues. But I think what boards beyond that, of course, they have to do that, necessary but not sufficient, is to understand how to create environments and culture that new ideas can blossom and that leadership is rewarded for an appropriate level of risk taking. It's very hard to innovate if you don't have a culture that supports and rewards risk. Or even worse, would be a culture that would have primacy around if something bad happens, punishment. What you really want is a culture that says, look, we know that companies need to reinvent all the time. And you need to have the culture and the talent that has the ability to think about that reinvention and how to do it and how to shape it and to be supportive of it. And it's very hard to do that if you don't have the right people.
And how do you create the conditions to ensure that once you have those right people, they're actually given an environment in which they can succeed? Because that's a challenging question. I mean, at Data Marin, we've been around now 12 years. We started as four. We're now about 130 people.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's really fabulous.
Thank you. And innovation is at the heart of what we do. We use AI technology to support companies in their own risk management and value creation. But we've seen that evolution of creating a culture that needs to evolve as the company grows and sort of balancing, what you need to achieve on a day-to-day basis with that risk taking. So I'm curious what you see as the conditions that are needed to support that.
From a board standpoint, I think one of the most important things is the statement of the board to the CEO and to the senior team about the willingness to invest and be wrong. So you need a culture that says, if you bat 500, That's incredible. By the way, I never use sports analogies, but you don't have to because those get me lost. You can't be right all the time. But that fear of being wrong is horrible. The fear of being wrong is constipating. Like nothing will ever happen. So the board has to say, "Hey, it's okay." And what that means in practice is approving budgets with maybe a little bit of cushion, with ability to stand up teams and be supportive of standing up teams whose whole jobs are to experiment and to try different things, and to make sure that the boardroom and the management team is peppered with people who think differently. That is hard.
That is hard.
But I truly believe that having in the boardroom and in the leadership team people that are sort of outside the mold a little bit, that can ask the quirky question, can spur the creativity and the innovative thought. So I think boards do need to create sort of that platform to ensure that people have the sense that the board will have their back. Now, can't risk the company, you can't do really, really stupid things, but the board, if you've got the right people, that's not going to happen. The bigger risk is that people don't do the big, bold thing.
I love that statement because I think today, in a world where essentially any statement, any move that you make as someone with power and influence can turn into, your 15 minutes of fame, good or bad, on a media outlet. And there's an opportunity with that growing transparency to call people out, so to speak. So I'm curious because you said, you need the right guardrails. You need to allow for innovation and bold moves. You need the right guardrails in place. Have you been in position when you're in the boardroom and you see innovation being presented as something that perhaps isn't as real or tangible as you'd like? It's more presented as something that is theater or fad. And in that position, what kinds of questions do you ask?
Listen, let me start with innovation can take all kinds of forms, right? And so, of course, you want substantive, sustainable, scalable. So you want all of those things, all those big words for innovation, right? But I would be careful to say that you always know it when you see it. If we were all so brilliant to know it when we see it, then wow, we would be really like be very powerful. But we don't. And sometimes that you think is like, is that a big enough idea? Or is that just like, that's just way too quirky? Or is that, in today's environment, sometimes it takes legs. It like suddenly, like, it's like, I have said, I never thought that that would resonate and be as powerful as it was. And you don't. So I guess my point is, we're not so wise sometimes to know.
If I were, it would be boring.
It would be really boring. Like, I don't know, let's say something really silly, like, sometimes innovation around color can be innovative. Like, you'd say, like, "Well, that's silly. It's not a big enough idea." Well, sometimes positioned and elevated, these things take on this crazy life of their own. So, I do think we need, as, directors, to push, but I've rarely been in a situation where I think, like, "Oh, that just doesn't feel right." Now, again, though, it's about the culture of the company. I have also sat in boardrooms where I think the team doesn't know what creativity really looks like or what sort of breaking out looks like. And so sometimes you need a little tough love.
Yes.
And I have been known to occasionally say things with love that are pretty blunt. And I think sometimes you need that. You need to say like, don't think that's going to get us where we need to get. And then the next question, it's not just the judgment. It's what do you think you need? Not what I think you need. What do you think you need if you needed to think differently about this?
So then it becomes that's how you create conditions.
That's how you create conditions. And then it's saying, you're not making a judgment about the individual. You're saying, look, I think this can be better. And I believe that you're capable, but you need to think about what do you need to do differently and put around yourself. And how as a board can we support you in doing that?
Right now, every industry is feeling that speed of change just given the technological advancements. And I think every company, to your point, has a goal. How do we apply AI? But we're going through a reckoning of sorts where we see the opportunity. We're figuring out what's the actual application and what's realistic within that, too. And so you mentioned as well having the right people at the table. And when we were preparing for this, I sent you a brief and you very politely called me out because I put something in there like, let's talk about women in the boardroom. And, what does female leadership look like? And how do we get more women in the boardroom? And you politely paused and said, I've actually been in boardrooms that are very well mixed. And oftentimes the male members of that boardroom bring in some of those codes that we typically apply to women, cultural sensitivities being one of them. So I'd love to unpack that a little bit and tell me more about your experiences.
So I grew up in an environment where there were, as I think about my career, there were very few, I won't say none, but there were very few female role models. So, we sort of just drafted off of the guys around us, right?
Hmm.
Over time, obviously, there's a lot more women, involved, and I went from, I love, this is one of my favorite things. So slightly off topic, but so I have two IPO bell ringing photos hanging in my office. Well, actually three, and I think this is relevant. My first was when we took GNC public, and it's all guys and me. And I'm wearing a gray suit, of course. I even remember I had a coat dress and a long, a coat, like a dress and a coat. It was very cute. But it was all men ringing that bell at the New York Stock Exchange. And so that was picture one. Fast forward about 10 years, actually almost 10 years, and it was my second bell ringing at NASDAQ. And it was when we took the Runway public, all women on the podium.
All women, not a single man.
All women on the podium,
Wow.
all in pink. It was the first full female leadership team. And so we were all women. And, it's like, and I would say, I love those two photos side by side. And then my third NASDAQ bell ringing was the Brilliant Earth. And that is the two co-founders, one woman, one man.
Okay.
Much more balanced boardroom. But what I wanted to say is, despite that all pink, in the Red Thriller boardroom were always these amazing men that I love the way you said coded female. I would not say that they were feminine in any way, but they had cultural sensitivities and they were all about supporting female talent. And they knew what the right language was and the right way to show up in the boardroom that honestly, unlike, be honest, at GNC, I was super gender aware. I would talk all the time about how that felt to be the only senior woman at the company. That wasn't even language that we used at Rent the Runway. Even though we were female led, we always had these amazing men. It became like a non-topic.
Right.
So I guess today, I sit on boards, Crocs. We have an amazing mix of men and women. Some of the men in the boardroom led female oriented businesses for a long time. And so again, the management team is also an incredible male female mix. It becomes like not even a topic,
Right.
honestly.
Which is ultimately where we want to
Where
get
you want to
to.
be.
Right. There is that mix, that diversity, not just in gender, in so many different ways, and especially in ways of thinking. And I'm curious, those sensibilities that you were speaking to, how does that change the conversation around innovation and risk management in that point of balancing short-term versus long-term value creation?
What's really helpful, I think, in the boardroom, and I'm thinking of very specific examples in my last 6 months, where there are directors who it shows up through being able to pull from their previous lives, provide stories and narratives of not like, here's what I used to do in the dark ages, but rather to talk about, here's something I experienced. Here's what I personally learned from that experience. And so it's a little bit of a gift. Here's my gift to you to show you, here's how to think about now your issue in that context. And it often comes down to what we talked about before. Do they have the right people? we haven't really talked about rewards.
No, we
Do
have
you have do you have the right reward system? And do you have the right mindset? People talk about process. Process is a mindset. And what sometimes you need to break is that as organizations get bigger, you think about what are impediments to innovation. Often an impediment to innovation are these processes that were set up at a point in time to protect,
right.
to do no harm. And so there's these rules and governors. And yet those rules and governors like can be dampening of like really going for it. And so when you like share stories of when that's happened and you sort of say like, I bet you have those like, do you have processes like that that are kind of standing in the way? And what can we do to like push them aside for the purposes of this?
Yeah.
And it can be very empowering to the team.
It is. And we've experienced that in our company as we grow up, so to speak, right? At first, it's a very small team and it still is small, but even that difference between 4 and 130, it creates more complexity, more confusion, internal communication becomes more challenging. And this idea of culture has to evolve with the more types of people that you have as part of that culture. So let's talk about rewards because, like you said, we hadn't talked much about that. But when you and I first met in California, we were all about we were yes. So the reward structure, so many different perspectives weigh in on that. And we've yet to talk about public investors, which we
Yes.
can get to next.
Yes.
But let's talk about rewards as part of creating the right cultural conditions.
Again, it all goes back to talent. I am a firm believer that you have to have compensation structures. And this is going to sound obvious. It's like, again, in compensation chair, what's the role of your compensation policies? It is to attract and retain. Great. That is so much harder than it sounds. So I chair and I have chaired. So I currently chair two compensation committees and I've chaired two others. So I have a little bit of pattern recognition. I've worked with four different compensation consultants. And so I've thought a lot about compensation structures that, first off, they certainly need to align with shareholder interests
Mhm.
and to make sure you don't do things that inadvertently blow back at you. But at the same time, you've got to be willing to try and do things differently sometimes with your comp structures to get the outcomes that you need and
Mhm.
want. So, beyond the base, like I got to make sure I've got competitive salaries and bonus structures. The long-term programs to me are the most important. Like the short-term programs, yes, they need to be around financial targets that are knowable, seeable. People need to know there has to be a stretch,
Right.
but people can't look at the stretch and go like, "That's just ridiculous," and they shut down. So, it's that healthy tension between like, that feels like a lot, but like maybe that kind of stretch versus that's just insane. I'm gonna just check out because I can't that's
Right.
not physically
You want it to
possible.
be motivated.
You want it to be motivated. So, but it's with the long-term programs,
Mhm.
which tend to be, in most cases, equity oriented, where you try to make, I actually think about for people and teams that do great work, I want to create generational wealth for them because these people are killing themselves. And I know because I can think back to myself around what kept me engaged and like even back at P&G, like it was an opportunity to create real wealth. And so I bring that headset, but it's got to be long term
Right.
and it's got to be aligned and it's got to be around sometimes it can't all be just hard metrics. Sometimes it can be event based. So, I've done some of that where there's a pretty big carrot for an event.
What would be an event that
Some
you
sort of,
would
for example, transformative financial transaction. So at a point in time at the Runway, we had a very challenging balance sheet and we needed to figure out a way to recapitalize the business. And so we put into place a program that was not controversial, but was coming from a place that the board knew what the management team would be driven by, and we needed to keep them in their seats because they were critical to getting to that outcome. So we put a pretty big carrot in front of them around a transformative transaction, which did occur. So that, it can be
Knowing what the motivation can
knowing
be.
what
Right.
and knowing what's also thinking about what really matters to this company.
Mhm.
Uh, and I also believe that it can be around things like are super important, like for a CEO, I think you can put bonus incentive structures around talent development.
Right.
So yeah, maybe in the short run, I'm not going to see that in my EBITDA, but if you don't create the talent that will allow that next gen to happen. And so you might say to your CEO, look, you, and it's going to be a little qualitative, but if you successfully get the team to the next place, there's going to be a reward for you.
You have to make decisions about balancing both short and long-term value creation, but you also have public investors who are looking at you through a glass window and have their own assumptions, their own expectations, their own objectives. Ideally, those are aligned. But what are the types of questions that you're hearing now in investor calls when you are in those earning calls? What are the investors asking you about now? Because also the types of questions that they can ask, there are certain guardrails there too now.
Well, also, investors have gotten really smart. They were always smart, but now with AI, like the ability to do the research to ask the hardest questions is like right there. And so these interactions have become, I think, probably more meaningful. I think analysts and investors have the ability to understand the business models much better than I think they ever did before. So there's always this sort of push and shove a little bit where you want to tell the story to the investors around what are our rarest and biggest diamonds, our precious assets, and get them to value them the way you value them. And especially when a story is complex. Because we used to say like investors have like the attention span. Like sometimes they don't have enough attention span. I think that's becoming less the case because AI can just feed them all this stuff.
Right.
Uh, and so you get these really important questions, I think, now around give us confidence that the things you are going to do are going to produce these outcomes. And so it takes this sort of like, as a board, you could kind of pull back and say, we're just going to make sure that we put points on the board every quarter and get to that next place. And I'm not going to say that it's not important to put points on the board all the time because you have to. Again, and you have to have the patience investors sometimes don't have to see where you're going and why decisions that look like scratch your head, boy, that hurts. Are you sure? Are sometimes, yes, the right decisions. And sometimes they don't reveal themselves for a few years. So you get punished in the interim. And, and that feels really terrible. It feels really, really bad. And yet sometimes you just have to like tell the team, like, we have conviction. We're all together going to get through this. And we're going to put in place the right things that prove us right. And sometimes it doesn't reveal for a little bit of time.
Do you find it sharpening just given, we talked about speed and expectation and, given your point now with the use of AI, investors are smarter. They can get information faster. Do you find that that tension between the short and long term is evolving just given the pace of change we're all experiencing when it comes to different types of innovation?
Yeah, I think everybody has got a shorter, I don't want to say fuse because that sounds like something's going to blow up, but
Right.
that we're in a market where people have these really expectations that everything just goes up to the Northeast.
Mm,
And like and there's very little patience. And that's why you see, I think, in the equity market, some of this incredible volatility because there's so many, I do think there's so many places to put your money.
so many.
And so things that people used to invest in because they knew these were well led companies that were going to even if they had a bad quarter, you knew. P&G was a classic. Like, he had incredible leadership and an amazing board, and yeah, it may have been a bad quarter, but in the long term, this stock was going to and they pay dividends, and today, there's so many other places to put your money.
There are.
And so, like, the patience of, like, "Why am I gonna sit here and stick with this?" I mean, it's consumer. In consumer land, when I could be putting and investing and so it's the tension
Yeah.
of why we are worthy of patience. And so the narrative and the story you tell and the finding the points of light that you can share and say, look, 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 look. And I think businesses have to become more resilient. And so, therefore, what does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean?
It means that you've got to have more than one swim lane. You have to have lots of different ways where you can make money. And some of them are shorter putts and some of them are longer drives. But sorry.
And another sports analogy.
Yeah, where did that come from? I don't even play golf.
I don't either. Oh, yeah, I don't know where they from, but I think everyone can get it. I hope.
You have to be able to do both, right?
Right.
So you have to have like the shorter things that are right in front of you, and you say, look to the investment community, this is right in front of us, and you're going to see this. And it can be a product, it can be a region, it's
Hmm.
part of the world, it can be a new, approach to marketing, like things that are a little bit more. And then there are things that are going to take more incubation.
Right.
And so that to me is what makes resilience. So if one thing is soft, you've got something, channels, like different channels, different geographies, different product lines, different like you have to it's much more about portfolio management.
Mm-mm.
You wow, you cannot be a one-trick pony today.
No.
If
No,
you're a
Brad the
one-trick
generalist.
if you're a one-trick pony, oh my god, you might have a really good period, but it is the law of nature that it's not gonna and so if you're a one tr y y you're not it's too much risk.
We've experienced that recently at Datamaran. We sold our product as a platform, and now we're diversifying. We actually have 4 products now that we can offer to the market. So we've just felt that very concretely. You even think, AI tech, right? It needs to diversify. I think there's an instinct to a lot of decisions that we all make as business leaders. But there's also the role of data. And now we almost have too much data, to your point, right? Getting information is the easy part, but the interpretation of that information is the hard part. And a big thing that I'm seeing now is, yes, there's this push to use AI, but there's also this understanding that it hallucinates. It doesn't always provide us the right information. I think, we're seeing headlines now of big consulting firms having to pull back things that they delivered to clients because it wasn't accurate. So, what is the role of data and technology played in your career? How important has that been for you?
Well, I would say, when you say data, the what people often said, "Why'd you leave P&G?"
Mm.
You know, you were more senior woman in an operating role, and, people said, "Well, maybe someday you could run the company." Yeah, whatever. But but why did I leave to go to retail? Like, people thought that my brain cells had somehow taken a vacation. I remember the CEO, that was this amazing man, John Pepper, calling me and saying, like, "What are you doing?" Like, and I believed that the kind of data that P&G was using at that point in time was sort of removed from the market. Like, this is really, but this was the very beginning of data warehouses and point of sale data. And in my mind, at the time, if you were in consumer, where was the real data? It was so I said, like, if I wanna be where the action is, and I said, I that was among other things, the motivation and speed. It was like, "Oh my god, I got it. Things gotta happen faster." So, was to have that, like, that glory of knowing, like, doing something and seeing it, like, in the point of sale information and seeing it in the traffic data and like,
Making it more concrete.
making it super you weren't getting it secondhand 6 months later. And by the way, that's one of the great things that Data Moran and similar, like, even in compensation, we're using these outdated data models that look backwards of like, well, this is what was true last year's proxy season. It was like, okay, that was an eternity ago.
In today's world, yes.
Like, we're using last year's proxy data to deter, like, oh my God. Like, so the use cases here of data that is
Mm.
current and in the, but that's what I see should be improvement. And so, but while people say like data, the truth is when I left P&G in the late 90s, there was that level of transformation where
Mhm.
data science became a thing, data analytics became a thing. You had these warehouses chock full of transaction data. It took everybody a while to figure out how to productize it and use it.
Right.
But once you did, my God, the power of understanding and insights. And so you have to have people that are oriented that way and know how to use it and can find those like nuggets.
Right.
So I'll give a great story. When I was at Rent the Runway, and this is a true story and so evidentiary of the use of incredible data. You know, people would say you Rent the Runway was the last thing that Rent the Runway was actually was an apparel company. No,
Mhm.
Rent the Runway. It wasn't really about the apparel. It was about the technology capabilities and it was about the data that came from this. So when the business model began, it was a special event rental business, right? So women who needed to go to weddings, black tie events, buying a black tie outfit was very expensive. You wore it once. Weddings, everything was on social media. Like that was the well-known genesis of the
It's
company.
revolutionized my wardrobe. Yeah, let's just put it bold very lightly.
So, but we always had relative levels of formality.
Mhm.
And our data scientists were brilliant. And so they coded levels of formality. I don't remember exactly how many levels. Well, I'm just going to make that up. Maybe we had five, with five being the most black tie, fancy, and one being maybe more cocktail, not quite. And suddenly we saw, and by the way, because we were an event business, we saw things mostly on the weekends, right?
Mm.
Our data scientists were in the data and they said, oh my God, we're seeing midweek rentals of our least formal inventory. Like, what are women using this for? And we realized, oh my goodness, women are renting for work events like giving a presentation or giving a speech or being at an event. Like, I've done that. Okay. And they rented our least formal to amp their wardrobe for something that was in their professional life.
And that's not something
And
you
that
intuitively thought of prior.
Oh, it was in
Huh.
the data, okay? And it was suddenly in the data, least formal, during the week. Oh my God. And then, of course, our founder and CEO, who had our own ability to connect the synapses and create a vision better than anyone on the planet, who said, my God, let's just create this closet in the cloud for everydayness.
Mm.
Talk about an interesting board meeting. We walked in and we had a new investor at the table. And we said, oh, by the way, we're changing the business model because, yeah, we're still going to do event rental, which is, by the way, where all the fabulous unit economics were. But like, we actually think there's a subscription idea about every day, but it was in the data.
And you wouldn't have seen that otherwise.
Maybe we would have intuited it, or maybe we'd have gotten it, picked it up through our, like, we had customer testimonials, like,
Mm.
like people commenting or taking pictures of themselves. So it was there in a lot of ways, but we got there a lot faster by mining the data, right? And the data was just, and it kind of just revealed itself in this kind of like, oh my God.
Yeah. And I love the story because, to your point, it took the mindset to see the data, but then to make the connections as to what does that mean for our business model. I have been in so many rooms where they've said, can your platform, Data Marin, just give me the answer? And it sort of is, you have to politely say it can guide you towards an answer, but you shouldn't be trusting this to give you the answer. It's giving you the insights to make better decisions, to validate assumptions, or see what maybe you didn't see before.
I see, to me, it is revealing what you may not have known or seen. It can prompt you to say, well, what should I do about this? It can kind of prompt you but it's not particularly creative in of itself. The creativity still comes from the human aspect.
Yes.
of being able to take that and then imagine something different.
And the imagination component. I truly believe that will not be automated. And I think that's why we're
I hope
hearing,
not.
the rise of generalists in humanities and
I hope so. Yeah, I really hope so. And I kind of believe it. So this thing about data, it's not a new idea. Like, that was really my point. It's generational, like, the kind of data and how the data is delivered and packaged and productized changes over time, but the importance of the data and using data and being able to access it and use it in a very easy fashion, that's a through line
Mhm. Yes, it is.
for great companies.
So thinking about imagination, we talked a lot today. You mentioned that you had at least 1 or 2 chapters still in you. I don't know if that was a thought from before or a thought from now. I hope it's from now. What are you imagining for some of the next steps for yourself?
Well, first, I love the boardroom. I love being able to be part of creating something that elevates and is positive impact. And I love being in different environments and being working with different talented people. So that is my current chapter. I hope that that will continue. But what I think about as my real next that hasn't fully manifested is taking my life experiences and being able to share it with a generation that I can help and elevate. And that's what gives me, I want to give what I can in the most productive way possible to that next gen. And I have like these really fun stories that are very illustrative. And so I do some speaking engagements where I make people turn off their phones, their social medias, no cameras, where I tell real life stories of stuff that really happened and what people should learn from it. And they tend to be very young professionals, maybe sometimes even students, like right about to cross the bridge.
Okay.
But then I invest a lot in mentoring. So I've been blessed. I've mentored some amazing, talented women and some men in relatively senior roles. And wow, that is what's powering me.
I love that.
And I'm very grateful to have these kinds of
Mm.
relationships and be at a place where I can create some of these communities and connect people and have people feel like I have my experiences still can be very helpful.
Yes. And you are a storyteller. You've written a book.
I've outlined a book.
Okay.
I've outlined a book, and hopefully at some point we'll do something with it.
Okay.
And
We'll have to have you back on that.
I'm searching for that title, but you gave me some good ideas today. But I do think that, and this is going to be very obvious, but not everything goes up straight to the Northeast all the time. I have survived like some pretty terrible stuff. And those stories are the kind that people most resonate with because it's like, oh my God, you can trip and pick yourself up. And so that's sort of the like, it's not always like success 101,
Right.
you know?
Right. Most
It's
people
just,
focus on the results, but the journey to get there, my goodness, it is not straightforward. As you've said, it is not easy. And I love this idea of, community and sharing perspectives and storytelling. And, that's what we're doing with this podcast. And so I'm curious, who else should we have on the podcast?
oh my gosh. Well,
We've had your friend Mindy Grossman.
yes. I will happily put together a list because I don't want to start naming names and then people will say, like, well, why wasn't I on the list? But,
Fair.
I have a whole cadre of these amazing women, for the most part, who have all been on the journey either alongside me or episodically, or this is the strange thing about life. Sometimes things are like a helix.
Hmm.
There are women that are now very much my life today that I can find a picture of us together 40 years ago, but it's not like it wasn't like just 40, like sometimes it kind of, goes in and out, but there's like some pretty amazing, spectacular women. So yes, I'm going to give you a list.
Okay.
But you asked me, and I do want to answer this question about sort of a last takeaway, a
Yes.
last sort of gift maybe of what for a board
Yeah.
of what would be a question and in a boardroom that everyone should ask.
Yes, I'm glad you brought it up.
Because I actually thought about it. And I really believe that the question the board should look at each other and ask, and it's not so much about the company per se, but it is about the relationships with each other. And the the question I would ask is how much do we trust each other?
It's an important question.
Because the truth is, over time, every board will face some very difficult, tough moments. The ability to get to the right answer, I really believe, is a board that trusts and in a certain way loves each other because it always needs to be in the end consensus decisions. But the path to consensus should not be consensus. The path to consensus should be exploration, tough dialogue, willing to be the person who is the sometimes the outlier. And to do that requires trust
Absolutely.
because you don't want to be the director that everybody ostracizes, right? Or the one that's viewed as like, oh, that person is just so disruptive. You want like, and you need trust and building. It actually should be an activity of the board to build trust. And part of that are people. I was in a board offsite a number of years ago where we took a couple of hours one afternoon and we went around the table and we said, share a formative experience you had as a child that reveals something about you and what's important to you today and what drives you today. It was fascinating, the stories people told and things that people revealed things that was like, in a million years, I would never have guessed that. And what it did was it built a little bit of board love. It created a sense of trust and family. And I think it helped us make some hard decisions because there was that we knew we kind of each had each other's back.
Right. That is, I love that because it makes it concrete. Well, those are really important points to end on trust and transparency. I mean, if we break down, we bloody use a lot of big words today: innovation, governance, culture, talent, incentives. But at the end of the day, it comes back to very basic human principles of trust, transparency, imagination, being bold,
Willing to take a little risk.
willing to take a little risk, right? There's
Yeah.
no reward. I so appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with
Oh,
all of
may I add
us.
one more?
Absolutely.
The willingness to be able to say very clearly when you were wrong, because
Being humble.
being humble, like, "I got this wrong. Wow, not didn't play out the way I thought you were or it was right." And, wow, I really took something from that.
Absolutely. I mean, vulnerability as a leadership quality is something that I have learned goes so much farther than trying to have the right answers because none of us have the right answers. We just try.
We just do our very best.
We do.
We show up in the very best way we can for the people that we care about and the people we're accountable to, and try to be the very best versions of ourselves that we can every day, knowing that it's not perfect.
And that's what makes the collective impact. So thank you for being with us today. We'll have to find a time to get some of those stories out, not on the podcast.
Mhm.
Thank you, Beth. Always so wonderful
It
to
was
spend
so
time with you.
wonderful to be here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm super grateful.
Of course. Thanks.